Today's video's been sponsored by Factor. Factor delivers fresh, never frozen, dietitian-approved meals straight to your door. I don't talk about it on this channel literally ever, but cooking is something I'm pretty good at, and it's something I enjoy doing for other people. When it comes to cooking for myself, though, 98% of the time, I'd rather just do whatever is quickest and easiest, which often means sacrificing the quality of the meal or just eating something unhealthy. Factor changes all of that. Too busy this fall to cook? Factor makes it easy to have a quality meal in a pinch just by tossing it in the microwave for a couple minutes. No shopping, no food prep, no cleanup, nothing, while still getting the flavor and nutritional quality you need. Factor has a lot of different options, but personally I really love the spicy poblano beef bowl. And speaking of fall, this season Factor's introducing new fall flavors, limited time only hearty, comforting meals featuring seasonal veggies like cranberry pecan chicken and apple Dijon pork chops. Once again, ready in just 2 minutes. They'll satisfy your fall cravings during the busy season without the hassle. So if you want some fresh, never frozen quality meals that are ready in minutes delivered straight to your door while also helping out the channel, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code gilly50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. That's 50% off your first Factor box at factor75.com with code gilly50. And thanks again to Factor for sponsoring the video. About a year ago now, I made a video covering all the mainline classic Mega Man games, and at the time, there were a few people wondering where the Game Boy games were. Well, here you go. During Mega Man's initial run on the NES, several games were made for the original Game Boy. In the US, these were numbered titles, much like their NES counterparts, but rather than being direct ports of the home console versions, the Game Boy releases were actually their own separate unique series. Sort of. The true name of this series as it was released in Japan is Rockman World, and somehow, up until this point, I had never actually played any of them before. So today, I'm going to be taking a look at each of them and see how they stack up to console 8-bit Mega Man. So it's going to be pretty straightforward here, and I'm sure I sound like a broken record if you've ever watched my videos before, but for those who are new, I'm going to be looking at every Mega Man game on the original Game Boy. So the Mega Man or Rockman World series in chronological order of release. Alright? Alright. The first game in the Rockman World series, known in the US as Mega Man Dr. Wily's Revenge. As I said in the intro, this series is sort of its own thing. Sort of. On one hand, it definitely does not stick to the same formula and story as the console games, but on the other hand, nearly every one of these, with the exception of one, follows a pretty strict formula which is mostly very derivative of the NES games, but with an odd twist. For the sake of easily referring to these games, I'm gonna just refer to them as Mega Man World to make it less confusing, but I'm sure I'll break my own rule very quickly anyway, so whatever. I say the story is unique, but to be fair, that's a bit of a stretch. If the title of Dr. Wily's Revenge didn't already give it away, after being defeated by Mega Man, Dr. Wily comes back. And this time he sends old Robot Masters after Mega Man to refight him, along with one new addition, but we'll get to that in a bit. Mega Man World actually combines elements from both Mega Man 1 and 2. See, instead of having 8 Robot Master stages, Mega Man World mixes things up by giving you 4 Robot Master stages based on Mega Man 1, and then once all 4 are defeated, you end up in the Boss Rush teleporter room, only this time, instead of refighting bosses you've already defeated, you go up against 4 Robot Masters from Mega Man 2. There actually isn't even a boss rush here, which, to be honest, I prefer. I never really did like the Robot Master refights in any of the Mega Man games, and it's always something I dread in literally every single game. It's probably obvious, but this is a much, much shorter game than its NES counterpart. Probably less than half as long, honestly, but that's if you're really good at it. Content-wise, it's much shorter than Mega Man 1, but if you're anything like me, it might take you just as long anyway. To put it bluntly, this game is rough. It is very rough. The boss fights are a bit of a joke. They're like laughably easy, but a lot of these stages are really difficult and not for good reason. The controls are, not great. To be fair, Mega Man 1 in general doesn't control as well as later entries, and it's pretty slippery, but unless it's just me, it feels like Mega Man World takes that slipperiness and cranks it up to 11. There's a whole lot of cheap enemy placement, frustrating platforming, and checkpoints are few and far between. I guess you could do a lot worse for a Game Boy game, and if I'm being honest, this isn't too bad for a first shot at Mega Man on the go, but dear lord, this is a far cry from the tight platforming of Mega Man 1, which is saying a lot because I don't even think all that highly of Mega Man 1, and it's very rough around the edges compared to every game that came after it. I guess it's unsurprising, though, that it's not as tight as the console game because it actually wasn't made in-house by Capcom and was instead outsourced to a company called Minakuchi Engineering. I don't want to say they did a bad job, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement here. One cool aspect of these games, though, is that even though they mostly retread old ground, each one does bring something new to the table, and in Mega Man World 1, that comes in the form of a Mega Man killer, Anchor. An all-new Robot Master and boss fight with its own unique set of mechanics and even its own new ability Mega Man can learn. There isn't too much lore here to explain, but Wily not only sent his previously defeated Robot Masters after Mega Man, but created an entirely new one, whose sole purpose and design is to eliminate Mega Man. His fight is actually pretty unique. Basically, his main weapon is an energy-absorbing lance, which can both fire off projectiles as well as absorb shots, making his attacks more fatal, but at the expense of him taking damage himself. The only way you can effectively deal damage against him is by shooting his lance itself and not Anchor. However, this increases the strength of his own attack, so you basically need to strategically fire off shots at him while making sure to dodge his attacks. It's nothing too involved, but it is a cool twist to a Robot Master fight which, up until this point, hadn't been done and had just been about learning boss patterns and avoiding attacks. Once defeated, you get his weapon, or rather, your own version of it called the Mirror Buster. The Mirror Buster briefly puts a barrier in front of Mega Man which sends projectiles back where they came from, and this ability needs to be used to finally defeat Wily. After taking down Anchor, you have, quite this slog of a Wily stage, and then take on Wily himself. His first phase is pretty straightforward, and you can just kind of spam attack his weak point, but once that phase is finished, that's when you need to use your new mirror ability and reflect Wily's shots back at him while also avoiding a normal physical attack. It's like 3 different attacks that you kind of need to juggle all at once, but it's a pretty interesting fight and pretty manageable as long as you stay on your toes. Once he's defeated, Mega Man travels home in a space shuttle, and the credits roll. And by space shuttle, I literally mean like a NASA space shuttle, like no like wacky video game ship. All in all, this wasn't bad. Apparently, a lot of the team were big Mega Man fans, and it definitely seems like they tried with this one instead of just phoning it in. But as I said, it definitely has a lot of room for improvement, and it's pretty rough around the edges. Not bad by any means, but definitely not one I'll be returning to anytime soon. So, Mega Man 2, or Rockman World 2, is supposed to be the black sheep of this series, or so I've been told for years and years. As I mentioned before, the prior game was developed by Minakuchi Engineering, and though I'm getting a little ahead of myself, they actually went on to develop the rest of the Mega Man Game Boy games, except for Mega Man 2. The second installment of the Game Boy Mega Man titles was handed off to a company called Thinking Rabbit. This apparently didn't turn out all too well, since Mega Man World 2 is generally considered the bad one of the bunch, and even Keiji Inafune admitted the studio didn't have much knowledge or experience with the Mega Man games prior to working on Mega Man 2. Much like its predecessor, though, it does follow a very similar structure. Robot Masters from both Mega Man 2 and 3 this time, with 4 to start. Although this time around, they did give it a little bit of a spin, as the boss teleporters warp you to an actual stage and not just a boss fight. Once again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. As far as the story goes, the game does not explain its story literally at all, so I'll just go over what the Wikipedia article is telling me. The story of Mega Man World 2 sees Dr. Wily once again attempting to take over the world. Shocker. This time around, Wily has stolen an experimental time skimmer, which I guess is a time machine with a fancy name, from the world's Kronos Institute and used it to travel 37.426 years into the future. Meanwhile, Mega Man is sent to investigate an underground passageway containing enemy robot masters from his previous adventures. This is all pretty par for the course for the series, but this time around there is a little bit of a twist involving the unique boss of this game, which I'll get to in a bit. So, from what I've heard from people, I was under the impression that this game wasn't very good. I'll admit, I never heard too many details as to why, and the only specific thing I ever heard was that the music was bad. People were not lying. The music from the previous game, while very dumbed down and simple, was still pretty okay. The music for Mega Man World 2 is absolutely atrocious. Not only are compositions even further simplified, but a lot of the sounds chosen are ear-grating. The soundtrack is bad. That much I'll admit. As for the gameplay though, I actually liked it a lot more than Wys Revenge. First off, the controls are noticeably tighter. It's pretty much night and day, at least to me. Mega Man isn't quite as slippery, and in general it's just less frustrating to play because the game is just a lot more fair overall. I'll admit it's definitely on the easier side, a little too much so, if I'm honest, and once again, boss fights are a total joke, but the level design and enemy placement are about 1,000 times more bearable than the previous game. Not to mention, they implemented E-Tanks this time around, immediately making the game a lot less frustrating in general. Stage layouts are very basic and nothing to write home about, but they really aren't any less interesting in my opinion than in Wys Revenge. They're just easier. Typically, I prefer when a game is more challenging, but that really only applies when the game is fair. Wylie's Revenge is kinda bullshit. Mega Man World 2 is just overall a lot more enjoyable to actually play. So as I said before, Mega Man World 2 has a bit of a twist that comes in the form of its original boss fight. Much like Wylie's Revenge and the Anchor fight, Mega Man World 2 has a similar encounter. But whereas the previous was a robot built from the ground up created for the sole purpose of destroying Mega Man, this game's penultimate boss, Quint, is actually a future version of Mega Man. The game obviously doesn't explain exactly how this happened, but after going to the future, Wylie captures that time period's Mega Man, remodels and reprograms him into his own personal weapon, and brings him back with him to the present to fight present-day Mega Man. Instead of the Mega Buster, though, future Mega Man, now known as Quint, pilots the Sakugarne, a rideable jackhammer pogo stick thing. As tragic as this encounter is, the boss fight itself is a joke. Once you beat him, though, you get the Sakugarne, and while actually a cool weapon that's totally different than your typical Mega Man ability, it's mostly kinda useless. Unless, of course, you want to use it to spam attack Wylie's first phase in the final fight against him. Speaking of, this is the strangest Wylie encounter ever, because normally he pilots these big, imposing, giant mechs, and this time around, not only is he physically smaller than Mega Man, but his mech is about as imposing as a Little Tyke's Cozy Coupe. He also has multiple phases in this one too, which took me by surprise. This time he has 3 phases, but they all don't really differ from each other too much. You get him down to like 2/3 health, he flees to a new mech, and then you continue the fight. It's pretty easy though, despite being a little tedious. Once defeated, Mega Man nukes Wylie, I guess, and then the credits roll. In all honesty, this wasn't even like 20% as bad as people had led me to believe. Don't get me wrong, I did not love it, and I have no desire to replay it, but it was alright the first time around, and I definitely enjoyed it a lot more than Dr. Wylie's Revenge. I'd say this one is worth checking out, although you should probably play it on mute unless you want to bleed from the ears. Hey, real quick, if you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, consider subscribing. It really does make a huge difference, so if you want to see more from me, maybe tap that button. That's all I gotta say. Back to the video. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the most unremarkable one yet. So, since Inafune and Capcom were admittedly dissatisfied with the results of Mega Man World 2, Thinking Rabbit were given the boot, and Minakuchi Engineering are back at the helm for the 3rd installment. When I say this one is the most unremarkable so far, I feel this is both a good and a bad thing. Good because the polish has been increased heavily, controls feel tighter, level design is a hell of a lot better, and overall, there's little dashes of polish that weren't seen in the previous 2 games. The music is better, albeit it's essentially just Game Boy renditions of previous Mega Man music, and the length has also been increased to a decent extent, with 8 traditional full Robot Master stages served up 4 at a time. Now, I say this is also a bad thing, because despite having everything tightened up and improved from the previous 2 games, the game itself is actually way more derivative of the console games than the first 2. As you'd probably expect, following the structure of World 1 and 2, Mega Man World 3 is based on elements and bosses from Mega Man 3 and 4. For me, this is partially a good thing, since Mega Man 4 is my favorite of the NES games, but it still felt like I was retreading a lot of old ground. Don't get me wrong, the level designs for each Robot Master are entirely different from the NES games, but it still doesn't do much to make Rockman World 3 feel unique. Also, no boss hatches this time, which is very strange. In the other games, despite having no true boss rush, the game still had the traditional boss teleporter rooms, but in this one, they axed it completely. Not that it really matters at all, but I couldn't help but notice its exclusion. Now, I didn't touch on this previously, but in Mega Man World 2, due to it being based on Mega Man 2 and 3, the slide mechanic was added. In similar fashion, being based partially on Mega Man 4, Mega Man World 3 adds the charge shot. Once again, a good and a bad thing. For me, anyway. I know people are a bit divided on the charge shot in general, some people feeling it's a good additional mechanic and some hating it, but I've always been in the camp of liking the charge shot. Maybe that's because Mega Man 4 was the first game I played, but anytime I play a Mega Man game without it, it feels like something's missing. I say it's a good and a bad thing in Mega Man World 3 because while I do prefer having access to the mechanic itself, the sound effect that plays is maybe the most egregious incarnation of it yet. I typically play Mega Man games with the shoot button held down, so I'm charging at all times, but this game makes it pretty unbearable to listen to. As far as difficulty goes, they definitely bumped it up. I wouldn't say it's anywhere near as frustrating as Wys Revenge, but it's a pretty big increase from the second game. This does make sense since the first game's developer returned, but it seems like they at least dialed back the difficulty just a little bit when compared to Wys Revenge, which I do appreciate. Some of the bosses even got just a little harder too, which was surprising since both previous games had piss-easy bosses. They're still nothing truly difficult, but they at least pose some sort of a challenge this time. Once again, unsurprisingly, I have no idea what the story is prior to consulting the internet, but according to Wikipedia, Wily's at it again, this time using a converted oil platform in the middle of the ocean to draw energy from the Earth's core to power a new machine. As the series is known for, World 3 introduces a unique robot master, another Mega Man killer named Punk, keeping with the musical naming schemes the Mega Man series is known for. His weapon is the Screw Crusher, an attack that flings rolling blades at Mega Man. He can also hurl himself after rolling into a spiked ball. One thing of note, he actually also has a Battle Network counterpart, appearing in Mega Man Battle Network 3 as Mr. Famous Net Navi. Keiji Inafune especially liked Punk and ended up using his influence as a producer to have him included in the game, as well as insisting on redesigning him personally. That's all well and good, but in the game itself, he's a complete pushover. His attacks are really easy to read, and his patterns are very easy to memorize, so despite him apparently being a super cool character, he was on my screen for a total of like 30 seconds. This seems to be a theme here, but much like in the previous two games, you do get his attack upon defeating him, but it ultimately goes underutilized, mainly only being useful in the final phase against Wily. On one hand, it's cool that this weapon is necessary to defeat Wily, but on the other, you get it so late in the game that you really don't get a chance to appreciate it, like at all. In the main console games, even the weapon you get after fighting whatever the last robot master is that you beat can be used in the Wily stages. But since in these Game Boy games, by the time you get the special weapon, the game is almost over, you really never get a chance to play around with it. All in all, World 3 is solid. It's definitely a good game and the closest so far that the Game Boy games have come to feeling like one of the console games. But at the same time, it's also super forgettable. Not bad at all, definitely worth playing, but I can't really think of a single thing that this does that's unique enough to be remembered. Although, at the same time, the Mega Man 4 fan in me says that you should probably play this if you like Mega Man 4, because it does have a lot of Mega Man 4 stuff in it, for whatever that's worth. Okay, I'm not even gonna dance around it. Mega Man 4, or Rockman World 4, is by a country mile the best and most complete Mega Man experience on the Game Boy thus far. Not only that, it goes above and beyond what even the NES games do. I had no idea how much they packed into this game before I played it. Naturally, I assumed it was a watered-down version of Mega Man like the other games have been so far, but it was not that at all. First of all, the controls have been tightened up even further. As far as 8-bit Mega Man goes, this controls pretty much perfectly. Super responsive and not slippery in the slightest. This time around, I'm sure you already know the drill by now, but the game is based on robot masters and elements from Mega Man 4 and 5. However, not only does this game not retread old ground in terms of a story, but it actually has full cutscenes and dialogue actually explaining said story, complete with a ton of really impressive pixel art, especially for the Game Boy. Now, this is a classic Mega Man game, so don't expect the story to be really all that involved, but this time, the annual Robot Master Expo is taking place, seemingly going smoothly till Wily appears in the sky and remotely reprograms many of the robots. Mega Man, however, resists the reprogramming and proceeds to go after Wily, who reactivated 8 previous Robot Masters, as well as, and I'm sure you saw this coming, a brand new one. Now, this story isn't the deepest in the world, but it also isn't just a simple intro cutscene. Story exposition and dialogue actually continues throughout the playthrough, which is something even the NES games never did. It's clear that Minakuchi Engineering, once again at the helm, really were Mega Man fans, and it seems they were excited about what they were making. There's many things in this game that were added seemingly for no other reason than to improve the game and make it unique from the console games. Some elements were carried over, like collecting the beat letters, allowing you to utilize beat to take down enemies. That was added, but they added so much more that I wouldn't have expected. This time, we have access to Dr. Light's lab, which acts as a shop where you can have items made for you in exchange for P-chips, which are collected during stages. Naturally, you have your consumables like E-tanks and lives, but we also have series staples like the energy balancer this time. The beat letters also aren't the only letters in the game either. After the first 4 Robot Masters are taken down, and you get access to the second half, you need to collect 4 letters to spell Wily to actually proceed in the game. This doesn't gate you out of progressing in any way because the letters are not actually hidden at all. They're right in plain sight, and it's more so about the added challenge they add. Added challenge they add. Good line. Good line that I wrote here in the script. I've never seen any of the NES games do anything like this, and though it's not too crazy of an addition, it does give this game a little bit more unique flair. You can even run into Proto Man in this one. He doesn't really do anything special like give you a secret weapon or anything, but if you can manage to find him in some of the various stages, he'll give you a handful of power-ups to help you out. Once again, this is nothing major, but it's cool to see him here. There's even this secret Mega Buster power-up that the game doesn't even tell you about, and it's not something you can actually find in the game per se. See, if you game over and continue 4 times in a row, you'll appear in Dr. Light's lab, where he'll upgrade the Buster for you. It doesn't increase the weapon's damage output or anything, but it does pretty substantially increase your rate of fire, which is admittedly pretty slow in the first place in the Game Boy games. The level design here is also leagues better than the last 3 games. It's much more fair without being too easy, and resembles console-tier level design much more closely. The Mega Man killer this time around is Blade. Or Balad? I don't know, dude. I've tried to find how to say this stupid thing's name multiple times, and apparently Balad is like technically how it should be said. But a lot of people are calling him Blade. I'm calling him Blade because Balad sounds pretentious. Mega Man, meet my new robot master, Balad. F you. Anyways, weapon is the Blade Cracker, which can lay immobile timed mines and also fire small explosives from the tops of his arms. Once defeated, you get access to his weapon, which allows Mega Man to fire explosives in all directions. Once again, this weapon then needs to be used against Wily, who this time around has 3 different forms, all of which are actually pretty interesting. Wily isn't crazy hard this time around, but the fights themselves are pretty engaging with patterns that are pretty manageable to figure out. The game is also way longer than the previous entries. This one is actually a full-length Mega Man game, complete with 8 Robot Master stages, multiple Wily stages, and unfortunately the boss rush returns here. This one took a little over 2.5 hours for me, which is like twice as long as the other 3 I played before it. I know the one coming up next is the one everybody is always raving about, so I kinda know they upped the bar even further from here, but Rockman World 4 is like 10,000 times better than the 3 games that came before it, and it isn't even close. They put so much care and polish into this, even going further than Capcom had with the console games. They really didn't need to go this hard for a Mega Man Game Boy game, but I'm glad they did. While the other 3 are games I don't think you necessarily need to play or would miss out on by skipping them, Mega Man 4 on the Game Boy is definitely a must-play. When the subject of the Mega Man Game Boy games comes up, it's pretty much inevitable that Mega Man 5 is going to be brought up and praised to no end, and for good reason. It's probably not a surprise to hear that this is the one game out of all of them that I was mainly looking forward to playing. I knew going into this that most of the Game Boy games are comprised of reused ideas and characters, but Rockman World 5 is completely different from the rest. Out of all 5 of the games, this one is typically the one people insist that you play, because it's actually a brand new Mega Man game, complete with its own story, bosses, level themes, music, enemies, everything. Minakuchi Engineering showed with Mega Man 4 that they had the capacity to really make a great Mega Man game with all the polish of a console game, and then some. And with this 5th installment, they took the opportunity to channel all that they learned with the prior 3 games they developed, and carried it all over into something brand new. Much like Mega Man World 4, Mega Man World 5 has the same cool pixel art and cutscenes that carry the story throughout the playthrough, and all the extra polish and flair that they threw into 4. The story this time is actually a little more elaborate. Still nothing too crazy for a Mega Man game, and it's still very simple, but basically, several months after the events of Mega Man World 4, Rock and Roll are going for a walk, when they're ambushed by a robot who calls himself Terra. Mega Man's attacks have no effect on him, and after being knocked out, a group of robots called the Star Droids, who serve as this game's robot masters, attack Earth. Mega Man then wakes up in Light's lab, where Dr. Light upgrades his Mega Buster to the all-new Mega Arm, a weapon capable of actually damaging these new enemies. It functions similarly to the charged Mega Buster, only this time it fires a fist which returns after being fired, dealing damage in both directions. Also introduced in this game is Tango, a cat companion similar to Rush or Beat who can attack enemies on screen, though I really didn't use them much, if at all. Now, all these new Robot Masters, or Star Droids, basically function identically to Robot Masters, only they're each named after planets in the solar system. This gets a little confusing because there's no elemental aspect of which bosses are weak to which weapons, so you kinda just gotta play it totally blind in that regard. Luckily though, most of them are pretty manageable with just the Buster. The level design here is basically the culmination of everything Minakuchi Engineering has learned thus far. It's tighter than it's ever been, with relatively interesting gimmicks. All the enemies are also brand new. I don't think I saw one returning staple enemy. All are brand new with their own unique patterns and attacks. The shop is also back, this time with 2 upgrades to the Mega Arm. One which can grab items for you, and another which can deal extra damage to enemies by grabbing them. That secret upgrade from the last game is also back, and more so this time. Game over and continue 4 times in a row, and Light will upgrade your attack. Do it 3 more times, and he'll upgrade it further. The fully upgraded Mega Arm is pretty insane. It charges up super quickly and also fires very fast. You actually kind of need to adjust if you're super used to the timing of your shots and jumps. There's also 4 hidden crystals in 4 of the stages, and once collected, Dr. Light will make you an item that halves the energy cost of all your weapons. This was another really cool addition, but it did pad playtime out in a way that was a little bit annoying sometimes, since a couple of the crystals could only be obtained when you had a weapon from a stage which needed that stage's weapons to collect, which makes backtracking inevitable if you want to get everything. Now, the other Rockman World games all have a unique Mega Man killer, and in the case of Mega Man World 5, we sorta get that. Instead of fighting one brand new Mega Man killer at the point where you would in the other games, we have a rematch against all the prior ones, whose designs have all been updated, as well as Terra. These fights aren't particularly difficult, but this was a cool inclusion. There is one more of these Game Boy exclusive bosses, but I'll get to that in a little bit. I was also taken by surprise by a couple shoot-'em-up sections. I'm never sure how to feel about these, and I typically don't like them. A similar case here, but there's also a shoot-'em-up boss fight, and that one is pretty okay. It's nothing amazing, but I will admit it's a nice change of pace since this game is particularly long and took me about 2 hours and 45 minutes to complete. Now, there is one more Robot Master boss fight, and even after all these years, it still took me by surprise. I had no idea. The game plays out as any other Mega Man game would. Boss rush and then Wily. But once Wily's defeated, the game isn't over. There's one more fight against this super deadly robot that Wily awakened named Sunstar. He turns on Wily despite Wily waking him up and then faces off against Mega Man. This is probably the most difficult fight in the game, but if you're stocked up on E-Tanks, you'll be good to go. Alright, so everything everyone told me about this game being good is true. They really knocked it out of the park with this one. The other games are relatively decent to good, but this one is on a whole other level. They made a full-length, fully original Mega Man game that easily rivals anything on the NES. Rockman World 4 was really good, but at the end of the day, it was still derivative. Rockman World 5 is a completely different beast, and I am appalled that it took me this long to sit down and play it. And that's all of them. I really didn't know what to expect going into this, but I ended up being pleasantly surprised. Mega Man World 1 was rough, and World 2 was fine, but with Minakuchi returning after the second game, it's actually pretty interesting seeing how when given the IP again, they kept one-upping themselves with each installment that they made. I think if you're a Mega Man fan, you should give all of these a shot at least once, but if you're not a diehard, I'd say it's not really necessary. Except for 4 and 5. 4 was great and easily parodies any of the NES games. It is still derivative and reuses elements from Mega Man 4 and 5, but it's definitely worth the playthrough if you've never played it. Rockman World 5, though, that's an absolute must-play, even if you're a passive fan of Mega Man. And if you're a pretty avid Mega Man fan and you've never played it, I urge you to do so as soon as humanly possible. The fact that it's a Game Boy game surprisingly has zero bearing on its scope or quality, and it deserves to stand next to all 6 games on the NES, as well as later installments. Well, we've covered all the classic games on console, all the Game Boy games, and now all that's left is a bunch of stragglers that appear either on obscure systems or are just one-offs on certain platforms. Next time I cover classic Mega Man, I guess I'll need to finish the franchise off by picking it up from there. Until then, go play Rockman World 5. Like now. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.